Okay, so we've just finished throwing and it's time to clean up the wheel. Now this is a super crucial part of wheel throwing is knowing how to clean up and get the wheel proper. So the first thing we need to do is take any usable excess clay we have, and as long as it's not super dried out or just like liquidy wet, we can put it back in the pug mill. So I'm going to go ahead and take this and make sure you scrape up any excess usable clay from your bucket, and we're going to walk back to the pug mill. Now remember, I'll have the hatch of the pug mill open for you so you can toss your clay in there. Notice how I don't use my hands to grab the handle to keep it nice and clean. We can then go back to our wheel. And the next thing we do is we really want to get all of our tools. And before I even take my tools away, sometimes I like to get a little bit of that excess clay off. But collecting all the tools you used, obviously you don't need the tools you don't use. That's why I didn't grab my ribbon tool there. And the first thing I'm going to do is use my own slop bucket and use the water in there to try to get off the bulk of the clay. Because remember, our number one goal is to keep clay out of the sink and just off the floor, off your tools, pretty much where it belongs, in the bucket, in the recycle bucket. So we're going to take some time to wipe down the tools. We can use our sponge. You can wash your hands off a little bit in here too. Now notice, my goal here is not to get these clean. It's just to get the clay off of them. We're going to do a final rinse when we get to the sink, but this way we get the bulk of the clay off of our tools. Don't be afraid to get in there. And remember, these tools are yours. So if you choose not to clean them that well, that's on you. But if you let them dry out, they're going to be harder to work with. You're going to have crusty clay everywhere. You're going to get it all over your locker, and it's just going to be a pain. So I highly recommend that you wash your tools, because then they're easier to use, they last longer, and they just look nicer. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and grab my tools, and I'm going to head back to the sink. Now notice I'm trying to very carefully cup them because we don't want to get water drips on the floor because that turns into dried clay dust spots. Turn on the water and I'm rinsing off the tools. Now notice I'm still doing this over the sieve in the sink. That's why we have these, to catch any excess particles you didn't get. And I'm also taking the time to wash off my hands here. But now's the good time you really get a good rinse on your piece. And at this point, like I said, you shouldn't have really any big chunks of clay on your piece. There should be no chunks in the sink. Notice I always have the sign, no chunkies in the sink. If there is, there's always a wash bucket in the sink you can use to put it in there. And I showed you my hand there that I'm not completely clean yet, and there's no point in excessively washing your hands because you're going to have to go clean some more. I'm going to open my locker, put my tools in there. Hopefully your phone's in there with your tools. I'm going to go back to the sink, grab a sponge, and I'm heading back to the wheel. So what I really like to do is start with the cleanest area and work my way to the dirtiest area. That's where you get the most efficiency out of your sponge. So the cleanest of the areas is the table on the back where my tools rest. So I'm going to go ahead and wipe that down first. Now, just a word of warning, this spot needs to be wiped down more than once. I've tried to wipe it down, and I think it looked nice, and then it dries and it's all filmy and dusty and nasty. But I'm going to start with that, and then after I've done that, I'm going to wipe down the outside of the splash pan in case you got any little drips or anything coming down. Then you work your way inward, once you've done that, to the rim of the splash pan. As you can see, things are getting dirtier as we're working our way inward. Clean the rim, pay attention to that. You can wipe off the wheel head. Then take the sponge and start wiping down the inside of the splash pan. That's where all the splatter will go that flies off the wheel. And I'm going to show you here. Oh yeah, so we've got some chunks down in there. We want to make sure we get those out. And we can just put those in our slop bucket. And you really want to, when it comes to the pan, it gets pretty dirty down there. This is where all the water settles, and this is where it's super important to get it clean. Now I'm going to take the pan off and show you guys what it looks like Now you don't have to take the pan off every time you clean your wheel, but it is possible. I want to show you when you take it off, that's what it looks like. And you can, the front one will pop off, and the second one you have to slide off out of this groove. And as you can see, I've got some dried clay on there, so that's a no-no on my part. But every now and then we'll do a deep clean and take this off. But most of the time during the week, we will just wipe these down and get all the stuff outside of the pan itself. Usually on Fridays is when we'll take the pan completely off, and we'll do a nice deep clean. But as you can see, I'm just going over it. I'm trying to get all the water and clay out I can from the pan itself. And you have to remember that little groove under there. A lot of times people just wipe out the outside ring of the pan, but that little groove deep down under there is where a lot of your water will go. I'm going to go ahead and wipe down the other side. And notice I haven't cleaned my sponge yet. This is a very efficient way of cleaning. I was able to wipe down the back, the outside of the ring, the top ring of the splash pan, and I'm even going to go ahead and wring out my sponge in my slop bucket a little bit and get some of that clay out and just finish up. This is like the first once over. This is the time that you really just want to get as much of the clay out of your wheel as you possibly can. And after you do this, then you can go and rinse out your sponge and make it clean. And notice that I took the time right now to wring out as much clay as possible because we don't want clay in the sink. So now I can rinse out my sponge, and yeah, it has some clay in it, but it has exponentially less clay than it would have if I would have just brought that sponge over here and started wringing it out. And also by wringing it out, I prevent myself from walking over here and dripping that slip all over the floor. And notice I'm wringing it out until the water comes out clear. See, it wasn't coming out clear, so I'm going to go ahead and go over it again. Wring it out, got nice clear water. Now I can go over the wheel, and I'll hardly have any work to do now. Now it's kind of just a once over, polishing it up, cleaning it up. So I can start with the back again, and you can also already see that dry dust is starting to form there. So you always want to go over that. Wipe it down, go on the outside. Really touch up any spots that still look dirty. And notice how now that my sponge is cleaner, I can flip it over and use the other side too. And what you're looking at now is really what your wheel should look like. This is really what I expect it to look like every day when it's clean. If you just plain old leave it dirty, you will get no points. But if you leave it kind of clean, if you kind of do a minor job, then you'll still lose points. And notice I remember to turn my wheel off, which is very important so we don't burn out the motor. Now I can take my sponges and my bucket. Oh, see, I'm going the extra mile here. I'm going to go ahead and wipe down the outside of the wheel and the floor. And this is an important note. Even I forget to say this sometimes, that a lot of times when you throw in the wheel, the force of the wheel, not all the water will go in the splash pan, but sometimes it'll splash out on the floor. And it is your responsibility to wipe that up. So make sure you use your sponge when it's fairly clean to wipe up the floor around your feet, because that also counts as losing points. And now we'll go over to this bucket. It has a grate over it so that it'll catch any of the chunks. And I'll pour my dirty water in there. This is where the dirty water goes, not in the sink, but in this bucket. And you'll notice when we look inside, we still have some clay in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab that clay with my hands, just scoop it out. And we can just either throw it back in the pug mill, or since it's so little, I'm just going to throw it in the recycled clay bucket here. And just try to get as much of that out as possible. Remember, you're not the only person who uses this. There is another throwing class who uses this bucket. So you don't have to make it shiny, pretty clean for them. But make sure you get all the clay chunks out, because everyone likes to have a fresh bucket. And then I'm going to do a nice once over here with my sponge because I care. And this is a very old dirty bucket, but it's nice to keep the outside shiny too. And then once again, you can wring out the sponge back into the bucket. Notice I'm putting it back into the bucket, even though there's very little clay left in there. And I'm going to get my sponge wrung out until it's completely clean. See, not clean, so we're going to rinse it some more until it's clean. It's looking pretty clear now, so I can wring that out. Oh, I'm going to do it again. See, this is what being thorough is all about. Now that that sponge is clean, I can put it back on the stack. And this, since it has so little clay in it, it's just basically dirty water. I'm just going to dump it over the sieve. Don't forget your little sponge, one of your most important tools. Now what I'm going to do is put my bucket back on top, make sure my wheel is off. I'm going to put my pedal up on the wheel, and I'm going to unplug my wheel. And a lot of people say, why do I have to do this? Because a lot of people in my intro classes will come and mess with the wheels, like we said, unplug it so people won't mess with it. And then make sure you also put your stool back at your assigned numbered seat at the table. Don't leave it by the wheel, put it back on the table where it belongs, and make sure your wheel pretty much looks like this. It should be clean, and we'll all be happy. And that's how you clean your wheel.